She brushed past me once, whispered a word I couldn't hear, and yet it changed everything. It was one of those ordinary afternoons that felt like any other. The cafe was humming softly, the smell of roasted coffee beans weaving through the warm air. I was buried in my notebook, half-heartedly sketching ideas, when a movement caught my attention. She appeared, almost like she'd been drawn into the room by some quiet gravity. I didn't notice her at first. She was just another patron moving between tables. But then she brushed past me, so close that the sleeve of her cardigan grazed my arm. The sensation was subtle, fleeting, yet it sent an odd ripple through me, like a chord struck lightly in a song I didn't fully understand. She whispered something as she moved, a soft murmur that my ears couldn't quite catch. And yet, I felt the weight of it. Somehow, her words were meant for me, even if I couldn't grasp them. I looked up immediately, heart thudding with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. She was walking toward the counter with a grace that seemed effortless, not flashy, not demanding attention, but impossible to ignore. Her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, catching the light in soft glimmers, and the subtle confidence in the tilt of her head made her presence magnetic. There was warmth in the way she moved, a gentle sway that felt almost like a rhythm I hadn't realized I was missing. I found myself replaying that brush against my arm over and over. It was absurd, really. How could a simple touch, a fleeting whisper, carry such weight? But it did. Even now, I could remember the faint pressure of her hand near mine, the softness of her sleeve against my skin, the delicate warmth that lingered like an echo. Something in me had recognized her before my mind could make sense of it. I tried to shake it off, to focus on my notebook, but the words she had whispered, or maybe the feeling behind them, clung stubbornly to my thoughts. It was the kind of moment that leaves you suspended between reality and possibility, where the mundane world continues to move around you, yet you're utterly still, tethered to something intangible. I glanced back, hoping to catch another glimpse, maybe a hint of her smile, but she had already disappeared into the soft bustle of the cafe. And that was it, or so it should have been. But as I sipped my coffee, I realized the encounter had left a mark. A whisper, a brush of skin, a fleeting glance. All these tiny details had imprinted themselves on me. My chest still felt lighter, my thoughts quieter, yet more alive, as though a door had opened somewhere inside me, and I didn't even know what lay beyond it. Little did I know, that brief collision of paths would be the start of something that would change the rhythm of my days, the cadence of my thoughts, and the quiet space of my heart. Some connections don't need time or explanation to matter. They only need a moment, a whisper, a touch, to leave an impression that lasts far longer than the encounter itself. After that first fleeting encounter, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Her presence had left an imprint that lingered in every quiet moment, like a soft hum beneath my thoughts. Days passed, yet whenever I stepped outside, I found myself scanning the streets, cafes, and parks as if I could will her to appear again. And, almost as if the universe were listening, she did. It began with small, almost accidental sightings. One afternoon, I noticed her across the street, standing by a bookstore, her fingers tracing the spines of old novels with a reverence that made me pause. She didn't see me, yet I felt like I was intruding on something intimate, a private ritual I was lucky to witness. The sunlight caught her hair, giving it a warm halo, and I realized that even in stillness, she commanded attention, not by asking for it, but simply by existing fully in the moment. The next time was even more surreal. In the corner of a small cafe, our eyes met briefly over the rim of a coffee cup. She gave the faintest nod, a quiet acknowledgement that both startled and delighted me. Her smile was subtle, almost secretive, but it carried a warmth that seemed to seep directly into my chest. When she stood to leave, our hands brushed as she passed. That delicate contact, fingers grazing briefly, almost apologetically, sent a shiver through me, a silent echo of the first encounter. I started noticing the patterns of her life, the small ways she moved through the world. In the park, she would pause by the fountain, tracing her fingertips along the edges, lost in thought. In the bookstore, she lingered over poetry volumes, tilting her head as if listening to the words in her mind. Every gesture, every pause, felt weighted with intention, though I knew it could all be ordinary. Yet to me it wasn't. To me, she had become a quiet puzzle, one I desperately wanted to understand. I found myself imagining conversations we hadn't yet had, rehearsing the words I might say when the universe finally nudged our paths closer. Each time we passed, my heart leapt at the mere possibility of a shared glance or a smile. Even the tiniest acknowledgement, a nod, a casual hello, the brush of her coat against mine, left me dizzy with anticipation. And yet, there was a tension I couldn't ignore. Part of me feared I was reading too much into these fleeting moments, constructing significance out of coincidence. Another part, the part that mattered more, hoped I wasn't. Hope and hesitation tangled in my chest like threads of silk and steel, pulling me toward her while warning me to tread lightly. By the end of those days, one thing became clear. Her presence was no longer something that simply existed around me. It had become a quiet force in my life, tugging at my thoughts, stirring emotions I couldn't yet name. The whisper, the brush, the fleeting smiles, all of it had transformed the mundane rhythm of my days into a careful dance of noticing, waiting, and hoping. I didn't know her story, but somehow, I already felt its pull on mine. It happened unexpectedly, of course, the way most meaningful things do. I had returned to the cafe that afternoon, notebook in hand, hoping to catch a glimpse of her once more. The air smelled of coffee and baked pastries, the soft hum of conversation wrapping around me like a familiar blanket. And then, there she was, seated at a small table by the window, sunlight pooling around her like a quiet halo. She looked up as I approached, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was a pause, the kind that stretches just long enough to make you hyper-aware of every detail. The subtle curl of her lips, the way her gaze lingered, the soft inhale that seemed to draw me in. My chest tightened, a low hum of anticipation vibrating through me, and I realized that the hesitation I'd felt in imagining her now confronted me in reality. I managed, my voice quieter than I intended, but somehow it was enough. "Hi," she replied, her tone calm, textured with a faint undertone of curiosity. Her voice wasn't loud or commanding, but it had a presence that made me lean a little closer, straining to catch every nuance. For a heartbeat, the world outside the cafe seemed to blur, leaving only the soft clink of cups, the faint murmur of voices, and the quiet gravity between us. We fell into an easy, tentative conversation. It started with the mundane, the cafe, the weather, a book she was reading, but beneath every word there was a subtle dance, an exchange of awareness that neither of us could ignore. When she gestured toward the cup in her hand, her fingers brushed mine for just an instant, enough to leave a lingering warmth that traveled up my arm and settled in my chest. That fleeting touch spoke louder than the words we exchanged, embedding a quiet, electric awareness in both of us. I found myself noticing everything about her. The slight crease of concentration in her brow when she laughed, the way her shoulder tilted as she leaned forward, the softness in her eyes when she paused mid-sentence. Every movement, every nuance carried a rhythm I wanted to understand, a melody I couldn't yet name. And yet, there was vulnerability too. Between the confidence of her posture and the warmth of her smile, I sensed a quiet hesitancy, a life that had seen more than I could yet imagine. It made her human, approachable, and, paradoxically, more magnetic. I wanted to tread carefully, to respect the unspoken boundaries, even as my curiosity and desire pulled me closer. When our conversation ended, I left the cafe with a familiar mix of exhilaration and longing. Her presence lingered like a shadow over my thoughts, the brush of her hand, the softness of her voice, the warmth behind her quiet gaze. All of it embedded itself in my memory. I realized with a startling clarity that I was no longer just noticing her. I was attuned to her, waiting for the next moment, the next brush, the next word. For the first time, I understood that some encounters aren't fleeting. They are invitations, subtle, quiet, and irresistible, to step into a world you hadn't known existed, guided by a presence you can't forget. It was a rainy evening when it happened. The kind of rain that fell in soft sheets, blurring the city lights and turning streets into shimmering mirrors. I had ducked into a small, dimly lit bookstore to escape the drizzle, only to find her already there, tucked between the aisles, her scarf damp and loosely draped over her shoulders. "Caught in the rain, too?" I asked, my voice a mix of casual curiosity and nervous anticipation. She looked up, and for a heartbeat, her guarded smile faltered, replaced by something warmer, a fleeting acknowledgement of shared circumstance. "I guess so," she murmured, her tone soft, almost shy, carrying a depth that drew me closer, even as I tried to resist. We moved toward the same aisle, our steps almost synchronized. A silence fell, comfortable yet charged. I noticed how she lingered over a book, her fingers tracing the embossed letters on the cover, and I felt an inexplicable urge to reach out, to let her know I was there. Our hands brushed lightly as we reached for the same novel, a fleeting touch, yet electric. Her eyes met mine, a brief acknowledgement of that tiny connection, and for a moment, the bookstore felt like a world unto itself, quiet and suspended in time. We began to talk, hesitantly at first. Small confessions spilled into the air, favorite authors, childhood memories, the little anxieties we carried through our routines. There was an honesty in her words that caught me off guard. Behind her calm, confident exterior, I sensed vulnerability, a quiet softness beneath layers of experience. And in sharing my own hesitations, my own quiet fears, I realized that I trusted her in a way I hadn't trusted anyone in a long time. At one point, as she laughed at a memory I had shared, her hand lightly brushed my arm, almost involuntarily. The touch was fleeting, yet left a warmth that settled deep in my chest, as though an invisible thread had been tied between us. I became aware of every subtle motion, the tilt of her head when she listened, the way her eyes softened when she spoke of something personal, the gentle cadence of her voice that seemed to resonate in sync with my own heartbeat. There was tension, yes, but not the dramatic kind. This was quieter, more profound, a tug-of-war between longing and caution. We both seemed aware of the unspoken rules, the age gap, the delicate boundaries of propriety, yet neither of us could ignore the gravity drawing us closer. Every shared story, every lingering glance, every accidental touch built a foundation of intimacy that words alone could not convey. When we finally parted that evening, stepping back into the rain, I felt both elated and unnerved. Her presence had opened something inside me, a quiet, steady ache for connection, a yearning that was both tender and profound. That day, I realized that some bonds aren't forged by grand gestures, but by shared vulnerabilities, by the courage to reveal the parts of ourselves we usually keep hidden. And in that realization, I understood that this connection, subtle, delicate, and charged, was becoming an integral part of my life. It was a late afternoon, the kind where the sunlight slanted low and golden through the city streets, painting everything with a warm, almost nostalgic glow. I had been walking home from the library when I saw her across the street, pausing under the awning of a small shop. Rain had just passed, leaving tiny puddles that mirrored the sky, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of wet earth and coffee from a nearby cafe. Our eyes met immediately, and something in that gaze stopped me mid-step. She smiled, a subtle curve of her lips that seemed to promise understanding, and then began to cross the street toward me. Time slowed. Every sound, every movement seemed to fade into the background. I became acutely aware of her proximity long before we spoke. The faint brush of her coat against mine as we walked side by side, the warmth radiating from her presence, the rhythmic cadence of her steps matching mine in quiet synchrony. Neither of us spoke at first. It was as though words would have broken the delicate tension that had built between us over weeks of fleeting encounters. Yet, in that silence, a conversation unfolded. Every glance, every small motion, the way her fingers brushed against the strap of her bag, the slight tilt of her head as she observed a passing dog, carried meaning. I felt my pulse quicken, a warm, steady hum through my chest, as if the universe had compressed into this single stretch of sidewalk. At one point, we reached a narrow alley where the sun caught the raindrops on the cobblestones, making them sparkle like tiny diamonds. She hesitated for a moment, glancing toward me, and I instinctively stepped a little closer, careful not to overreach, but unable to resist the gravity between us. Her hand brushed mine, not purposefully, yet lingering just enough to send a subtle shock through my body, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection we had both felt but never named. The air was thick with unspoken words. I could feel her breath lightly against my arm when she laughed softly at something in the street, her warmth brushing my side. There was an intimacy in that moment that didn't need explanation. The closeness of two people who had slowly peeled away layers of formality, revealing the tender curiosity and quiet longing underneath. As we walked, our shoulders occasionally brushed, her hair catching the sunlight and grazing my cheek. The subtle tension was nearly tangible, each glance and movement carrying the weight of everything we hadn't said. I realized, with a strange mix of exhilaration and fear, that this small, ordinary walk, filled with silences and light touches, had become the most meaningful moment of my day. When we finally parted, lingering at the corner of the street, her eyes held mine for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. The air between us thrummed with anticipation, a promise without words. I knew then that something profound was unfolding, a connection deeper than either of us had expected, waiting for the moment it would finally speak aloud. It happened on an evening that seemed ordinary at first, yet would be etched into my memory forever. The cafe where we often crossed paths was quieter than usual, the low murmur of conversation softened by the gentle hum of the heater. Outside, the city lights reflected off wet streets from an earlier rain, painting everything in golds and blues. I hadn't expected to see her there, yet when I entered, she was sitting at the same corner table, a book in hand, looking like she belonged entirely to that moment. Our eyes met immediately, and my chest tightened with anticipation. She gestured for me to join her, and I hesitated, the familiar nervous flutter of excitement coursing through me. When I finally slid into the chair opposite her, the space between us felt charged with all the moments that had come before. The brushes of hands, the fleeting smiles, the glances that had stretched time itself. We spoke casually at first, about books and coffee, but there was an undercurrent in the air that neither of us could ignore. She leaned slightly forward, her elbows resting lightly on the table, her fingers loosely intertwined. When she shifted, her hand brushed against mine, and I felt a jolt of warmth run through me. That quiet, electric kind that makes you hyper-aware of every subtle movement. Then she spoke, softly, almost as if afraid to break the spell. "I've been meaning to tell you something." Her voice was low, intimate, and somehow it resonated straight into the hollow spaces in my chest. My breath caught, and I realized I was leaning in, drawn as if by an invisible thread. She whispered a sentence I will never forget, words laced with a mixture of honesty, vulnerability, and a quiet strength that made my heart ache. It wasn't dramatic or theatrical. It was simply her truth, something she had held close until now. As the words fell into my ears, her breath warmed my skin, her gaze locked on mine, unwavering. It was as though time had slowed, the world around us dissolving into a soft blur. The hum of conversation, the clatter of cups, the faint drizzle outside. It all faded, leaving only the two of us in that suspended, fragile moment. Her hand shifted slightly, brushing against mine again, deliberately this time. The contact was grounding, intimate, but entirely respectful, a perfect balance of closeness and restraint. I felt the weight of everything unsaid over the past weeks lift, replaced by a shared understanding, a recognition that the bond between us was real, profound, and undeniable. I didn't respond with words immediately. Words felt clumsy, incapable of conveying the rush of emotion building inside me. Instead, I let my gaze linger on hers, tracing the contours of her face, the subtle warmth in her eyes, the slight curve of her lips. In that silence, everything that had been tentative, fleeting, and unspoken became tangible. The whisper had changed everything. As she pulled back slightly, a soft smile playing on her lips, I realized I was no longer the same person who had noticed her on that rainy afternoon. I had been drawn into something deeper, something delicate yet unshakable, and I knew, without doubt, that this connection, this quiet, whispered revelation, would shape everything that came next. The days after her whisper were a strange mixture of anticipation and quiet contentment. Everything felt subtly different. The rhythm of the city, the hum of the cafe, even the simple act of walking down the street. I noticed her more, not just as a fleeting figure, but as someone who had begun to occupy the spaces between my thoughts. And when we met again, it was with a new understanding, a shared acknowledgement of what had been building slowly, quietly between us. We found ourselves together that afternoon at the park, the place where the sun filtered through autumn leaves, casting a golden mosaic over the benches and pathways. She sat on a worn wooden bench, a book resting on her lap, her fingers idly tracing the edges of the pages. I approached, my footsteps hesitant, but she looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that felt like an invitation and a reassurance all at once. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. "Not at all," she replied, shifting slightly to make space beside her. The warmth of her presence hit me immediately, comforting and steady, like a heartbeat I had been waiting to hear. We sat there together, shoulder to shoulder, occasionally brushing as we reached for a cup of coffee from the small picnic basket she had brought. Each touch was gentle, deliberate, and safe, a lingering graze of her fingers over mine, the light press of her hand against my arm as we laughed at something trivial. There was no rush, no urgency, just the quiet intimacy of two people learning the cadence of being close. She spoke softly, telling me about her day, her dreams, and the little things that made her smile. I listened, fully present, noticing the subtle tilt of her head, the warmth in her eyes, the tiny movements that spoke louder than words. I felt the tension of weeks past dissolve, replaced by a steady, grounding sense of connection. The age gap, which had seemed so significant in my mind, now felt irrelevant in the face of this mutual understanding and respect. At one point, she shifted closer, her cheek brushing lightly against my shoulder as she laughed at a memory. I could feel the warmth of her breath, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat through her arm resting near mine, and a sense of completion settled over me. This wasn't a dramatic climax, but a quiet resolution, a feeling of rightness, of being exactly where we were meant to be. When we finally rose to leave, our hands found each other naturally, fingers intertwining in a way that felt familiar and inevitable. She looked up at me, a gentle, knowing smile on her lips. "I'm glad we met," she whispered, echoing the words that had once been fragile and tentative. Walking together through the golden-lit streets, I realized that the story we had been writing, one of fleeting brushes, whispered words, and unspoken tension, had found its gentle, satisfying conclusion. The connection we shared was no longer tentative. It was lived, tangible, and warm. And though the world around us continued to turn, I knew that some moments, some connections, would remain timeless, etched in memory and heart alike.